genius of the mind. So many stories to unwind.
Welcome to the Writer's Bog. In my last video, I talked about getting into the mindset of how to write a story, about how you should take advice and experiment with different things, and also gave a few examples of traps that new writers should be wary of. In this video, I'm going to lay the groundwork on what you need to start a first draft. First things first, the rule about using what works and not using what doesn't from my last video applies to these tips. Some of them will hopefully work for some of you, but I'm sure there will be tips in here that not everyone ends up using. And that's fine, I'm not staking anything, I'm trying to convince you that these are unequivocally the best things to do. I just found that they work for me and for others. And if they work for some people, they'll work for some others. First thing I'm going to tell you about is structure. Every story has structure. A random hodgepodge of noises isn't a song, it's just noise. A sequence of events that happens without structure isn't a story. It's a list of random shit that happened. There are a lot of different ways stories are structured. Most common in Western stories is the 3-act structure. So for the sake of simplicity, whenever I talk about stories or structures or thises or thatses, assume I'm talking with a 3-act structure in mind. What is the 3-act structure? Well, like literally everything under the proverbial sun when it comes to writing, it depends on who you ask. For the most part, it seems writers can agree on a few things about the 3-act structure. Mainly, that it's divided into 3 acts. These acts are commonly called Act 1, Act 2, and, you guessed it, Act 3. Act 1 is about establishment and build-up. You introduce your reader to your main characters, the world that the main characters inhabit, and what the status quo of the main characters is. Generally, near the beginning or the middle, or sometimes the end depending on who's talking, of the first act. Something disrupts the status quo of the main character, often, but not always, as a direct result of the main antagonist, which kicks off the story. This something is called the inciting incident, an incident that incites a story. Act 1 generally takes up the first 25 to 30% of the book. Act 2 is where you would raise the stakes and expand on the conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist. The situation often becomes more dire as the second act goes on. More characters are introduced, more subplots, more thises, more thatses. Act 2 usually takes up the middle 50% of the book. Act 3 is the climax and the resolution of the story. The whole story is built to lead to the climax, the final boss, the confrontation at the very end. And the climax leads into the resolution of the story, the aftermath, the new status quo for the main characters. Act 3 is also where most subplots are resolved and concluded. Act 3 also tends to be the shortest act of the book as the final 20 or 25%. There are a lot of variations of the 3-act structure, and there are a lot of different structures out there that you can use which aren't the 3-act structure. There also tends to be more subpoints inside of each act. I touched on a few already, being the inciting incident and the climax. If you want to know more about the 3-act structure, either wait for a video or go look it up. All you're getting from me right now is an overview because we got a lot of shit to get through today. With that nice, long, explanational overview out of the way, here's my second piece of advice. Come up with an ending first. Why? Because if you have an ending in mind, you have something to write towards. Having a destination often helps keep you going in the same relative direction. Sure, you can veer off course and you can wander and meander, but having an idea for the ending never hurts and often only helps. And it doesn't mean you can't change your ending later either, it just helps to have a general destination. If you need help coming up with an idea for the ending, ask yourself a couple of questions. 1. Who's the main character? 2. What's the main character's goal? What do they want that's driving them forward through the story? 3. At the end of the story, do they ultimately succeed at getting what they want, or do they fail? And 4. If they do succeed, is that actually a good thing, like getting revenge? And if they fail, is that actually a bad thing? How does it affect their life after the story if they lived through it in the first place? Now, you don't have to answer all of those questions or be 100% sure with your answers. You can write a revenge story without knowing whether or not the main character will actually choose to take revenge in the end or not. But it helps knowing whether he'll get the chance in the end at all. You don't need to have a specific idea for the climactic scene or anything like that. The more important details you can decide on for the ending, the better, but in practice, you usually don't need much. Once you get the basic idea down for the plot, next you should probably do some research on outlining versus discovery writing. I'll explain it now, but I could go on for hours about all of these topics, and I think it's always a good idea to have multiple sources. So listen here, then look at more details when I'm done. I'm trying to teach you how to fish, not catch one for you. In case it's not obvious, outlining a story is when you outline a list of events that will happen in the story before you write it. Discovery writing is sitting down without an outline and writing whatever comes to you in the moment. Some people have very strong opinions on whether you should outline or discovery write. There are even very prolific authors who disagree vehemently over which one people should do. Truth is, you should do whichever works for you. For some reason, people act like once you decide to outline a book, you have to outline all of your books in the future, and you have to outline them all the same way. That's called some bullshit. I'll teach you a few different ways you can outline a story, and if any of them sound appealing, try them out. If they don't, you can come up with your own way, or look up another way to do it. Or you can try discovery writing, which I'll talk about next. Just because it's called outlining doesn't mean you have to follow any strict formulaic method of outlining you had to use in college. Like I said in the previous video, the point of the first draft is to get the idea for your story out of your head and onto the page. In a way, outlines are just a distillation of that. It's setting up the key points you need to write towards, and then the first draft becomes simply filling in the blanks between whatever events you wrote down. Here are a few ways some writers will outline their stories. Some people will find a graph with a 3-act structure or other structure that they understand and find useful, then fill in each point on the graph. For example, they'll write down what the inciting incident is, then the first plot point, the midpoint, then the climax. Some writers will write a 1 to 5 sentence paragraph summarizing what happens in each chapter, and some writers will go even deeper and bullet point what happens in each individual scene. Those are just a few ideas to get you started. Before I get to discovery writing though, there's one last thing I'll touch on when it comes to outlines. Just because you have an outline doesn't necessarily mean you need to follow it. If you write a scene differently, then it's bullet pointed and it veers off the story in a different direction. There's nothing wrong with that. If you like the new direction the story is going in, you can keep following it and ignore the outline. Or you can edit the outline to match. Or you can decide you don't like the new direction. and rewrite the scene to fit in with the outline again. Follow the outline as long as it helps, but you're not forced to keep following it if it hinders. The last topic for today will be discovery writing. This is when you have an idea for a story in your head, and the way you expand on your story is by sitting in front of a blank page and writing whatever comes to you. Personally, I think I view discovery writing slightly differently than most people, but maybe I don't because I'm not them, so I wouldn't know for sure. But in my head, because the first draft is supposed to just be the blueprint for your story, discovery writing seems like it's actually just a very, very in-depth version of an outline. And having an idea for the climax of your book is much more important for discovery writing than outlining, because there aren't as many guardrails to keep you on track if you discovery write. There are a few different ways to discovery write a story too. The first way is the most obvious one. When you write a new story, you start by doing absolutely no prep and just write whatever comes to your mind. This can help make a story more unpredictable or give it a feeling of intrigue, but writing a first draft from beginning to end this way can be confusing, and you'll probably have a lot more work to do for the second draft with lining things up and editing than you would if you prep the story a little before you start writing it. The second way to discovery write is to do some prep work before you start the first page. Come up with a quick sketch of the main character and the main antagonist, figure out what the setting will be and what the ending would be. If you do that, you can use the first draft to develop your main character along with your story, so you don't have to know everything about them before you start writing. You discover them at the same time you discover the story. Another way to discovery write is to do a bit of outlining in the beginning just to get yourself going. For one of the stories I wrote, I outlined the first act by bullet pointing each chapter. Then I wrote the first draft up until I reached the end of my outline, and then, get this, I just kept writing after that. I got about halfway through the book, hit another roadblock, so I went back and outlined the next few chapters, then wrote to the end of the outline, and kept writing again. Rinse and repeat. So there's my very basic, shortened, summarized view on things you should think on before you start writing your first story. I think my next video will focus on the 4 pillars of storytelling, and with that video you should have enough to finally start cranking out that idea that's been in your head, driving you crazy. Until then, thanks for watching. See you there.